Imagine a scenario. Your neighbour is playing music loudly every night. So you go and knock on your neighbour's door, and you say to your neighbour, you're playing music every night, you're keeping me awake, I am unhappy about the fact that you are playing your music. And your neighbour says to you something which you didn't expect. You're actually factually wrong about that statement. That is not the case. And there are a couple of responses that you'd be likely to have in that sort of situation. The first is you would feel that you hadn't been adequately listened to in some way. And if you felt that you had been adequately listened to, that you hadn't been properly understood, you would feel that you were being snooped on in some way, or that they were watching you in ways that you were not fully aware of. There would be a question as to what methods, what devices, what perhaps ways of watching or listening to you were at work in the way in which they were able to take your complaint and to respond by offering a set of facts about your emotions and about the psychological situation. And I think this gives a clue as to some of the things that I'm trying to unpick. The first is the question of how is it that as a society today we have come to make so many factual claims and reports and representations and measurements about our psychological feelings. Questions which you would think were questions of subjective assessment, concepts such as happiness, emotions, are now spoken of routinely as quasi-natural, almost physical or objective matters of fact. I think there's an interesting question about how it is that we have reached a situation where the language of psychology is increasingly being conflated with the language of the natural sciences and the language of biology. The second question is, how is it that these types of claims, these types of factual claims about our inner feelings, about our happiness, have acquired such an authority in our society today that we routinely look to them in search of ways of resolving differences? When we have dilemmas, when we don't know how to act, when we're seeking guidance on what to do, these sets of facts about our happiness, about our affect, are turned to in the hope that they can resolve disputes. Now, that's not just the case in the areas such as public policy or government. It's also something quite common now in the business world and increasingly in our everyday life as people set about trying to achieve objective representations of how they're feeling. Now, one of the things that concerns me deeply about the broader happiness industry is the way in which many of the proponents of happiness science and happiness economics do not seem willing, or certainly not in an open-ended way, to debate some of these kinds of questions. And one of the, Richard Layard, who many of you will know, is one of the most famous proponents of happiness economics and happiness science. He writes in his book, if we are asked why happiness matters, we can give no further reason. It just obviously does matter. I think it is important that we do at least ask questions about how we came to be interested in these things in the ways that we have become interested in. Now, let's just step back and take a few examples of what I'm talking about. Now, probably the most famous example of how happiness measurement has risen in profile in Britain in the last few years is the rise of happiness statistics. The Office of National Statistics now polls society on its reports of subjective well-being, reports of life satisfaction, how anxious were you yesterday, how happy were you yesterday, and this is creating large new bodies of data that can be used by policymakers and economists. More recently and potentially more influential over our everyday decision-making is the rise of wearable technology and the kinds of mood monitoring apps that are carried around in smartphones, products such as Got a Feeling, Mood Panda, quantified self-type activities where people are seeking to collect facts, quantitative facts about how their feelings are collected over time, but ultimately aims to help people change decisions about how they go about their everyday life. So it is totally entwined in questions about how to live. There are also new methodologies that are sweeping the social sciences at the moment and economics. Neuroeconomists are increasingly interested in the neurochemical dopamine, which is often referred to as the reward chemical. And in some of the more exaggerated economics papers by neuroeconomists, there's actually a hypothesis that maybe quantities of dopamine in the brain are directly proportionate to behavior in the marketplace and to changes in price fluctuation, that maybe dopamine is actually what has been driving economic behavior all along. There are some of the more manipulative examples of this kind of thing. So there are face scanning technologies such as Affectiva, voice scanning technologies such as Beyond Verbal, which are used by marketing companies and used by what's sometimes called people analytics in workplaces and that kind of thing to collect data on mood. And there was also the Facebook mood experiment, which was reported last summer, where they'd been manipulating news feeds to try and look at how emotions travel through social networks and to look at how whether Facebook could actually change the emotions that were traveling through social networks. I think at the more, what might seem more outlandish end of the spectrum of these kinds of technologies, there are things like the British Airways happiness blanket, a kind of blanket that you wear over you while you're probably in business class and changes colour as your body gives off signals. At the Cheltenham Literary Festival a couple of years ago, a face scanning technology developed by a company called Qualia, which would collect data on smiles of people as they walked around the festival to try and get some kind of evaluation as to how successful the festival had been. Now, these sound quite outlandish. It's no longer enough to say that these things will never happen or they just seem like at the kind of sci-fi end of things, when that's probably what you would have said a couple of years ago about the idea that Facebook was manipulating your newsfeed in order to run experiments on your mood. Now, I think sometimes we get distracted by quite 20th century Cold War images of surveillance. I think it's perfectly plausible that a great deal of these technologies and these surveys and methodologies are developed for our own well-being, for our own good. But I think it's worth having a critical think about what underlies this assumption that it's possible to collect objective data about the feelings of other people in ways that bypasses the kinds of narrations and explanations that they give about their own life. Now, I want to quickly cover the question of why is this happening now? And this is where I think sociology is more useful, and sociology can answer questions that perhaps those who are practicing some of these techniques are less able to reflect on. The first is the rising importance of psychological engagement in post-industrial jobs. A lot of the happiness literature demonstrates how important a positive affect, a positive psychological orientation is to productivity in the workplace. Andrew Oswald's research on this shows that happy employees are 12% more productive than unhappy employees. There's endless data collected by the polling company Gallup on how employee engagement matters to the macroeconomy, with only 30% of the US workforce actually psychologically engaged in their jobs. This costs the US economy $500 billion a year. It's an astonishing amount of money. The second is the dramatic rise of depression and anxiety in ways that is increasingly framed as biological, medical problems that are located, if not necessarily in the brain, certainly in forms of bodily behavior. And the third is we now live in a society where forms of evaluation, forms of audit that were previously only possible within enclosed institutions are now possible out in everyday life. It is now possible to collect data in those open public spaces, in spaces of everyday life. And wearable technology and smartphones are the most obvious example of that. That's how I would explain why happiness has come to matter in the way that it has. For those reasons alone, I think we need to challenge the argument of some of the happiness economists and proponents in saying that this is simply obviously what we need to do, when clearly there are underlying instrumental dimensions to it, and clearly there is an underlying political economy to this agenda. There is also, in some ways, nothing so new about this after all. Many of the aspirations to measure happiness and to found decision-making in data about psychological feelings actually date back to the 18th century, most famously to Jeremy Bentham at the end of the 18th century, whose theory of utilitarianism suggested that public policies and laws should be designed in ways aimed to maximize measurable human happiness. He was one of the first people to argue this, and it develops over the subsequent 200 years, moving around as an ambition between economists, between behaviorists involved in market research, early human resource management theorists such as Elton Mayer in the 1930s, and up to the present day, where there's been another explosion of this interest in measured feelings in the mind. The question is, what actually would be wrong with this? And I think to get to the heart of the critique, we actually need to go to Bentham. see what Bentham argued and try and unpick some of what I think are some of the philosophical contradictions. At the heart of Bentham's project was a belief that language has a tendency to mislead us. And language is most dangerous when it is used in a way that is appealing to political values, to ethics, to philosophy, to metaphysics, and that human beings are liable to be led astray by abstractions, by philosophical and ethical concepts that actually don't refer to anything. And for Bentham, this was dangerous. It was dangerous both in its more traditional conservative manifestations, as when a monarch might claim to have a divine right given by God or whatever. It was equally dangerous in its radical manifestations, as when French revolutionaries or American revolutionaries were appealing to the rights of man. Bentham was scared that this kind of language about natural rights, about things that were inherent in the nature of human beings to pursue certain notions of the good and so on, that this was dangerous because it would lead us to pursue things which actually have no empirical existence. Meanwhile, the natural sciences, to Bentham, looked like a model for how language should be used. The natural sciences involve very precise linkages between terms and physical entities. And for Bentham, the task for a progressive rational politics was for language to be used in a similarly clear and referential way, and underlying what concerns political actors and policymakers is the fact that human beings have a natural propensity to pursue pleasure and to avoid pain, and therefore the language of pleasure and pain, the language of happiness and unhappiness, was the only scientific basis on which to conduct public policy decisions, because it was the only way in which politics could be rooted in natural empirical claims about human beings. What is wrong with this Benthamite view of language? Well, I think the first thing we can say about it is that it involves, if not silencing, then at least discrediting the reports and the explanations that human beings give about their own lives and their own explanations of how society is as it is and how suffering has arisen in the way that it has. And that's what my illustrative example of complaining to the neighbour was getting at the beginning. For instance, if you have a deep sense of injustice about something, if you feel that some injustice has been done, something which was actually purely designed to make you feel better would be based on a misunderstanding of the importance of that sense of injustice to you as a human being, and also the importance of your narrative about how that injustice came about, who was to blame for it, what it would take to remedy it. Our capacity to explain our experiences is being undermined by the rise of this infrastructure of psychological measurement of feelings. Secondly, I think what we can see at the moment, and I think this is very much derived from a Benthamite view of politics, is that politics has to become increasingly mediated via the body. Forms of unhappiness become conceived of as medical problems to be alleviated, if not necessarily through medical treatments, through quasi-medical behaviorist interventions. But we can see all around us, and I think the rise of wearable technology in the workplace and in relation to fitness and so on, is a manifestation that our reliance on our own reports, our own language, our own capacity to verbalize experience is giving way to embodied somatic physiological representations or physiologically derived representations of what we're feeling and of what's wrong with society or what's wrong with particular types of experience. Thirdly, and this gets to the heart, I think, of what is mistaken in Bentham's philosophy, there is a contradiction, and you can see this a lot in happiness economics today, where happiness has to play a dual role in Bentham's philosophy. On the one hand, it plays the philosophical role of being what ultimately matters for all human beings. It has an ethical, almost transcendent status as being what all human beings just naturally want to achieve. This is manifest in when Layard says we can give no further reason why happiness matters, it just obviously does matter. In a way, this rests on a similar sense that Bentham also shared, that happiness had this kind of transcendent, almost unquestionable teleological status. But at the same time, it has to be something which is measurable, behavioral, physiological, empirical. So on the one hand, it's playing a role that is transcendent and almost kind of metaphysical, and on the other hand, it has this kind of mundane status as something which is manifest in things like my pulse rate. In a way, there's something very mundane, very empirical about it. Now, in some ways, this can be dealt with through a kind of bolting together of mystical or metaphysical theories about human experience with quite rationalist, behaviorist, scientific accounts of cause and effect. And you can see this in a way in which mindfulness has been mobilized by corporations, by employers. A recent report by MPs suggested that all civil servants should be trained in mindfulness techniques because basically they were getting too stressed and taking too much time off work, and therefore mindfulness would kind of relax them. But ultimately, this is a kind of an effort to bolt together a metaphysical, religiously based theory about human beings with a behaviorist account of what causes pleasure and causes pain. And you can also see it a lot in the language of management, sort of what the kind of David Brent sort of tragedy of management is, that it is unable to either be fully engaged in efforts to control people nor fully engaged in efforts to ethically embrace people, but is sort of constantly trying to flip between, sort of moving between the two. What happens, given this contradiction at the heart of the Happiness Project, is that in an effort to try and overcome the contradiction between an ethical philosophy and a behaviorist science, is that certain techniques, certain methods, certain measures end up being granted a form of political sovereignty. They end up being granted power over us by virtue of the state or other types of authority granting them power. An example of this would be something like the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that is used by the American Psychiatric Association to classify specifically what is meant by depression. You know, it has to last for 2 weeks. It has to have certain types of symptoms. So that the behaviorist agenda of trying to extend scientific categories to account for basic human ethical and philosophical questions becomes dealt with through use of power to assert them. That, I think, is where the project starts to go wrong, because methods go from being forms of knowledge collection to potentially forms of political and social control. You're probably wondering, so how would I go about any of this? What would be an alternative? Ultimately, if you don't have any particular problem with the idea of your neighbour reporting back to you that you're wrong about your own explanation of your happiness, then maybe there's nothing wrong with this whatsoever. But I think we do have to question what is the limit to this kind of agenda, because this agenda has risen rapidly over the last few years, and it's continuing to grow the whole time. The challenge today must be to somehow reauthorize people to narrate and explain their own experiences in ways that go beyond simply reporting on feelings as if they were simply facts. There must be a reauthorization of people to offer credible explanations and narratives about the experiences that they have, even when those don't necessarily chime with what appears to be the case according to particular forms of surveillance or audit and so on. And in a way, that needs some teaching, I think. Contemporary happiness agenda involves teaching of mindfulness and happiness and so on in schools, but in 1961, Raymond Williams was suggesting that we teach children how to participate in democratic meetings in schools. Very, very different idea of what it means to be a human being. One, a silent relationship to the self. The other one, a vocal relationship to the other, a capacity to engage in forms of deliberation. And I'll just give you one example of this. A few years ago, I used to do some work on cooperatives and employee-owned organizations. I went to visit one of the very first public service mutual spin-outs. This has now been part of the government's agenda since then. It was the Rochdale Borough-Wide housing, which was some council-controlled and council-supplied housing, which was spun out into a mutual, and which was then going to have a governance structure so that employees of the housing service and residents of the houses could participate in a mutual governance structure. And mutual governance structures are incredibly difficult to get right because people are not used to having a say in how things happen. And they gave the example of one woman who sat on the governance board of this new mutual. The first thing she brought to a meeting, this was about several thousand houses, I need new double glazing. And that was how she had approached the opportunity to give some kind of feedback, was a statement of private demand, a statement of sentiment, if you like, because sentiment is something which arises in a private sense of, I have this particular kind of private need, and I'm going to use this feedback mechanism to simply chuck it into the system. But they said that over the course of several months, and they all had training, by the end of her first year, she was engaging in a public, deliberative fashion with the rest of the governance board in ways that was attuned to the fact that private feelings of unhappiness that simply relate directly to that institution are not adequate for getting it running. So I think that the reason it's important to allow people to make complaints and to verbalize their complaints is that through learning that one is an authorized narrator of one's own unhappiness, that one will be listened to when one explains why one is unhappy, that it gradually is possible to move towards a more public, more deliberative, more social view of what it means to be a human being having experiences, and a different way of articulating happiness and unhappiness. So although there's some condemnation of much of the happiness industry, it's not founded on a belief that it's good for people to be unhappy, or that we should just be left alone to be depressed or miserable, but that it is a critique of the idea that the facts of psychology are adequate to develop prosperous and happy human societies.